My name is Sam Butler, and I'm executive director of a nonprofit in Detroit called D4, which stands for Doing Development Differently in Metro Detroit. We're a nonprofit that was started a little over 10 years ago, dedicated to what we call equitable development. But also, we were started kind of with the charge of taking this community benefits movement that was emerging from New York, LA, and applying it to Detroit and really figuring out how can we continue that movement and what adjustments, do or don't have to be made when you're dealing with like a legacy city like Detroit. Since then, we have been monitoring and part of the Detroit Community Benefits Ordinance since its inception. We currently sit on the city's Equitable Development Task Force, which is actively talking about how to improve the Community Benefits Ordinance. So happy to get into that. In fact, at the end, I have some like food for thought that we can get into about the CBO. We also have helped numerous community groups across the city negotiate private community benefit agreements, so even outside of the Detroit CBO. But first, I thought it would be helpful if we sort of just like kind of all checked in about nomenclature and make sure that we were using the same terms. But I think Sarah and Jeff have already like covered many of these terms. So, a community benefit plan, I view as sort of like a document that describes how developers, other stakeholders, will engage the community and provide community benefits. And as Jeff noted, the federal government is requiring a lot of these plans as part of their application for, federal grants and loans, et cetera. Community benefits ordinances are where there's some sort of municipal ordinance that requires a developer to go through a process to identify these types of benefits. And as we just mentioned, for legal reasons, they are usually tied to the approval of public subsidy or some other incentives, but they don't necessarily have to be. Having said that, though, in Michigan, we have some very strict courts that have like actually struck down and taken a very conservative view of Nolan-Dolan precedent. And then last, community benefit agreements, right? I mean, this is a legally binding contract between a developer, community representatives, sometimes government bodies. And, I think the hope is that at the end of a community benefits plan or at the end of a community benefits ordinance, there is some sort of community benefits agreement. And I guess, the major point that I want to make on that is there are community benefits agreements that are led by the city. And then there are plenty of instances where the community and the developer are just reaching a contract agreement themselves. And in some ways that is sort of like the original genesis of this idea and like the original definition. It's since then has like the movement has adapted and grown and morphed and whatnot. And as Sarah's earlier graph shows, like there are just more and more CBAs across the country. An alarming trend that we've seen at D4 as we're talking to some of our partners nationwide, however, is there's a lot more, let's call it community washing. So like there's a lot more either city governments or developers using the word community benefits or community benefit agreements rather disingenuously. So they will sign agreements that maybe didn't have any community representatives at the table at all, right? But they're doing it sort of as a way to just kind of make their project seem better than it maybe truly is. So we can, if you'd like, happy to go into those trends as well. I also think it might be helpful for us to sort of just like kind of take a step back and like ask a big picture question. Why community benefits, right? And I think this goes to the question that was asked earlier about, exactions and contract zoning. Aren't normal planning, zoning, approval, and entitlements processes, aren't they enough? Aren't they already meant to protect the community? And I would say by and large, zoning and approval processes do help protect communities from normal externalities, right, that result from a project. However, I personally feel that if all we're doing is just mitigating negative externalities, then that's not really a community benefit, right? That is just something that the law should be doing on its own. A community benefit, to me, really is something that helps promote larger racial, social, and economic equity. And I think in every development, there is an opportunity to achieve those goals. And I think CBAs are part of this like larger movement that is thinking about development more holistically and helping to make sure that a development can be, more than the sum of its parts. I think a CBA also allows some flexibility to address community concerns that aren't directly tied to land use. So for instance, the picture you see on the screen is actually my neighborhood. This is where I live in Detroit, right by the Ambassador Bridge. The Ambassador Bridge wanted to expand their customs plaza a bit, and the community did not want to see this. However, a lot of the community concerns were really about like, well, if you do this, what's to stop you from just keep on going? Like it was really a concern related to larger land speculation. So through a community benefits agreement, we were able to contractually bind them and prevent them from acquiring any more property in the neighborhood. And this is after 40 years of them just rampantly buying property and speculating. So I know today we wanted to talk about elements of community benefits planning, and so that's what this slide is meant to kind of introduce. I think whether we are talking about a community benefits ordinance, a community benefits plan, or a private CBA, these kind of 4 steps are involved in some way, shape, or form in every process. So I'll go through each step individually. The first is, I think you need to identify the community. Who is really impacted by the project that is being discussed? Are there localized impacts that need to be addressed, to help the surrounding population? Or are there more global ramifications, right? Either at a citywide or regional level. Like for instance, is this a regional employment hub? Obviously, large infrastructure projects will naturally have a regional focus. And so you need to be able to kind of like identify who is being impacted at those various geographies. And then once you do that, I think it is important to also then talk about like, well, who represents those impacted communities? If it's place-based, are there local community groups? Are there local NGOs that can help represent the local population? Is it issue-based? So if there is, like I mentioned, an infrastructure project, are there transit riders groups or transit advocates that need to be included? If it is going to be a large employment center, how are we talking to trade associations, labor unions, things like that? So, I think I heard that Jeff is already thinking about like the multifaceted stakeholders that will be involved in his Tech Hub project, which is wonderful. But yeah, so I think it's really important to always be thinking critically about like who is impacted and who represents that impacted community, which by the way, is a huge problem that we've seen over and over again with the Detroit Community Benefits Ordinance. So on the screen here, you see the impact area that was drawn for the Future of Health community benefits process, and the city. So I should say that the planning department chooses the impact area for every community benefits ordinance process. And by law, they have to include the census tract where the project is based. So I think in this particular case, they, included the census, there were 2 census tracts that had to be accommodated, and they also grabbed in, I believe, a portion of 5326 here. The problem is like one could argue that project maybe had larger citywide ramifications. And so the way the Detroit Community Benefits Ordinance works is 9 representatives from that impact area are selected to represent the community and negotiate on the community's behalf. But when there are larger ramifications, sometimes there are tensions there. And I think that certainly came up most recently with the Future of Health CBO. Next, I think once you've identified who is impacted and you've kind of like brought them into your coalition, it's important to prioritize the community needs. And this, time and time again, we've seen not only through the CBO process, but in our like private negotiations, this is the hardest part, right? Getting a coalition of groups and people with all different values and desires to get consensus on what they are going to be asking for first is hard stuff, right? There's no easy way to do it. It just takes a lot of hard conversations and a lot of iterations, and eventually you're going to have to get there. And I think the coalitions that have done the best job at negotiating for their interests are the ones that had a really, really tight and cohesive prioritized list of what they were going to push for and what they were willing to trade off, as in any negotiation, right? Both parties never gets entirely what they want. I will say when there is a negotiation between two adverse parties, and oftentimes with community benefit agreements, you're talking about some sort of community coalition and a developer. I think there's two schools of thought around negotiating strategy. There's one that says, the community should just throw out a big laundry list of asks, right? Throw out everything you can. And that can maybe help set the Overton window in your favor. The downside, the risk, I would argue, is that it allows the developer to pick and choose what they want and what they most inexpensively can provide. And we even saw this with the Future of Health, where the Neighborhood Advisory Committee, which is that 9-member body that I mentioned, they threw out a bunch, and the developer was able to say like, oh yeah, well, we will happily provide these things, and we're providing a majority of what you're asking for, right? So it early on painted the Neighborhood Advisory Council as like perhaps unreasonable, perhaps unfairly, I would argue. The other school of thought is for the community to really just reduce the list at the get-go and say like, here are our select priorities. And if you do not address these priorities in some way, we will be angry. So depending on the political situation and the development itself, might determine how you decide to go on that negotiating strategy. I think it's also important to then look at the project and recognize that in every project, there are some inherent or latent opportunities for community benefits. So for instance, if it's a residential project, you're always going to want to talk about affordable housing. If there is commercial or retail space, I think it's a good idea to be talking about, is there dedicated space for small, local, or disadvantaged businesses? How are we targeting hiring? I think not only can you target hiring related to local zip codes, which we've seen in plenty of CBAs around the country, but also you can target certain populations. There's a project in Oakland, California, where they were hiring hundreds of new workers. And one of the criteria that they chose to target was returning citizens, right? That was just something that the community identified as a priority. Ideally, when you're talking about targeted hiring, there is a dedicated percentage of new jobs that will go towards your specialized hiring population. Developers, at least in my experience, are pretty loath to do that. They never really want to sign on to a certain percentage. However, we have found that some employers are willing to give a first review. And with the Future of Health CBA, they did that as well. So they are committed to reviewing applications from the local zip codes first, and then Detroiters second, and then the rest of the world after that. If you happen to be working on a tech or innovation hub, and Jeff, I don't know if anybody who's going to be working on that soon. I think not only should you be talking about targeted hiring, clearly you're already thinking about training and workforce development. I mean, I think that is wonderful. What you said about K through 12 education, I think is fantastic. I think there's also not only should we be thinking about how are people trained to get into jobs in the project, but once they have a job, what career pathways are we laying out so people can really go up the ladder? And for me, I always think about like, is there a janitor or is there a security guard that maybe wants to get into a more specialized position? How are we providing career pathways for them? I think there's also some really interesting opportunities, and this is a new emerging field that I can talk about, is how, are there ways that the community can actually invest in the project? So D4 is working on some ways where community members can safely invest in real estate projects and actually reap dividends as that project makes a profit. I think with a tech or innovation hub, I mean, a question I might ask is if there are new companies or new VC opportunities, how can we use the Michigan Mile Act or some of the new federal regulation crowdfunding rules to give community residents a like safe way to invest in some of those projects and maybe profit from them? I know that's maybe a radical idea, certainly not trying to put anybody on the spot, but just throwing it out for food for thought.
Sure.
And then in any project, I think there are opportunities for local hiring and apprenticeships during construction, environmental sustainability, as well as contributions to local nonprofits and local impact funds. And then once you've, identified all of that, I think the last step is matching the needs and opportunities. And so this is also the hard part. Almost always the community will want more benefits than the developer is willing to provide or the projects can bear. So then it really becomes a question of who has the final say of what gets included in the agreement. So in the case of the Detroit CBO, Detroit City Council has the final determination in their negotiations with the developer. With a private CBA, it's whatever the community negotiating committee and the developer can successfully agree on, really. And then with the community benefits plan, Jeff, I'm not sure what the like structure will be, but if there's a steering committee, I'm sure you're already thinking about what type of community groups or other impacted stakeholders sit on the steering committee to help figure out like how do we match the community needs and the opportunities presented. So there are many, many types of community benefits that have been negotiated in Detroit and across the country. I will not bore you by going through all of these slides, but I mean, there's many, many ideas, many examples. I will pause on this one, which talks about local hiring and procurement, right? Because I think this is particularly relevant to what we're talking about. Jefferson North, this was an assembly plant. They agreed to first review for local residents. They also donated almost $8 million to workforce development programs. The Milwaukee Bucks Arena had a really robust CBA, and they said half. So they did make a commitment that half of their employees would come from targeted low-income neighborhoods within Milwaukee. They also established a labor peace agreement, which allows them to unionize if necessary. The most recent Detroit CBO is Hotel Water Square. And one of the things that we pushed for was that same sort of like union neutrality, which the developers have agreed to. And then I think there's always opportunities for local procurement. So Detroit, we have something called an Executive Order 2014-5, which calls for 30% of total contracts to be coming from Detroit-based businesses. Bedrock voluntarily committed with that. So I think in any project, we can be thinking about, how do we create a circular economy to make sure that this project is boosting up local residents as well as local businesses as well. And then the future of health of course, is a complex project unto itself. I know it's particularly important to the people in this room. These are just some of the highlights of some of the community benefits that were negotiated as a part of that CBA. And I have to admit, it's kind of impressive. Like it really is quite a lot. And you can see that there are some things that are directly related to the project itself, such as, greater affordability for some of the residential units. There's first review hiring and job fairs and ban the box. But then there are also some things um, that impact the larger neighborhood and the larger city, such as the $2 million donation to the affordable housing. Um, I call it the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, but technically it's the Affordable Housing Development and Preservation Fund, as well as, Henry Ford will be donating land and money for a community land trust. So that's not something directly tied to the future of health development, but that was a big community need that they heard, and it was successfully provided in the CBA. So I know I'm running short on time, but this slide is just meant to illustrate like other things we've seen and other CBAs across the country. So there's a lot. Some new frontiers that D4 is working on. I think there are new possibilities to give residents more opportunities to grow with their neighborhood. So as projects come online, how are we making sure that, residents can flourish in a wealth building type of way? So as I noted earlier, there's, been some recent CBAs that brought in that provided land for community land trusts. And then also, as I noted earlier, we are doing a lot of work on community investment vehicles. So how can residents and low-income Detroiters, this is my North Star for this project, how are we safely allowing low-income Detroiters to invest in these projects? And so if you're going to do that, certain things need to be in place. There needs to be a backstop and guardrails that guarantees the principal for community residents, because as everyone knows, projects go south all the time. And low-income Detroiters probably need some favorable liquidity options as well. They also need the ability to invest nominal amounts and maybe on a monthly basis. So there are some projects that have come online across the country where community residents can invest in a development for as little as like $10 a month or $25 a month. So I think this is really important because we want to be able to find a way where Detroiters can own more of Detroit land and that they can profit from that land as it develops. Last but not least, I know there's been a lot of conversation about the Detroit CBO. I am happy to get into the ins and outs of that. I will quickly say that the Detroit CBO, where we see most of the problems, one is the Neighborhood Advisory Council. So it's a 9-member body, as I mentioned. Only 2 of them are elected by the community. The rest of the 7 are appointed by some combination of council or the planning department. And as you can imagine, and we have data to back this up, that those appointees sort of, like they run within social and professional networks, and they maybe have some incentive to not rock the boat as much as maybe the community would want them to. And then we've also seen that, the NAC they will negotiate something with the developer, and then it goes to city council for approval. And this is also where we've seen some problems arise, because inevitably other interested parties, other interest groups, equitable development advocates like D4, then we get into the mix, right? And we have some influence with city council. And so city council, at least in the past few agreements, Future of Health and District Detroit, they negotiated quite a bit more than what the NAC did. Now we can argue and talk about whether or not we think that is fair to the developers or not, but it does create some very interesting questions related to democracy and community legitimacy and things like that in both good and bad ways. So the Detroit CBO is one where the community negotiates and the developer really isn't sure what the community will be asking for, right? Every time we go through this path, it's something new every time. And while that customization is good, there's some other examples that I think sometimes run more efficiently that are maybe worth considering if a city were thinking about creating a CBO from scratch. So for instance, New Rochelle, New York, they have a community benefits ordinance where if you're developing in their downtown, there's a menu of community benefit options. And so and those options were created in conjunction with community, but once that menu is set, it provides the developer with a much more efficient and they would argue predictable path for how to provide community benefits. But these are all important conversations, and I really look forward to helping however I can as Lansing is taking this stuff up. And that is it. Thanks, guys.